The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Wellington's penthouse office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where he sat reviewing quarterly reports. At 42 years old, had built an empire that spanned 3 continents, with holdings in technology, real estate, and manufacturing. His net worth had recently crossed the $10 billion mark, a milestone that barely registered in his mind anymore. Numbers were just numbers after all, and had long ago stopped counting. His assistant, Jennifer, knocked softly before entering with his usual morning coffee, prepared exactly as he liked it, black with a single cube of sugar. She placed it on the corner of his desk and handed him a folder containing the day's schedule. Barely glanced at it. Mondays were always the same. Board meetings, conference calls with international partners, lunch with potential investors, more meetings. The routine had become so ingrained that he could navigate it with his eyes closed. What couldn't navigate, however, was the growing emptiness he felt despite all his success. His marriage to had become a carefully choreographed performance, 2 people sharing a last name and a residence but little else. They attended charity galas together, smiled for photographers, and maintained the image of the perfect power couple. Behind closed doors, they were strangers who happened to live in the same 15,000-square-foot mansion. Was beautiful, accomplished, and came from old money herself. Their marriage 5 years ago had been called the wedding of the decade, with coverage in every major publication. Her family's connections had helped expand into European markets, and his wealth had bolstered her family's declining fortunes. It was a merger as much as a marriage, and both parties had understood that from the beginning. What hadn't understood was how lonely a merger could feel. That particular Monday started like any other, but it would end in a way that would shatter everything thought he knew about his life. The morning meetings dragged on, filled with presentations about market share and profit margins. Contributed when necessary, his mind sharp and focused on the business at hand, but part of him remained detached, going through motions he'd performed 1,000 times before. By mid-morning, needed a break from the sterile environment of his office tower. He told Jennifer he'd be stepping out for an early lunch and would return for the 2 o'clock conference call. She nodded, already used to his occasional need to escape the confines of the building. Grabbed his coat and headed for the private elevator that took him directly to the underground parking garage where his driver waited. Instead of getting into the car, waved off his driver and decided to walk. The decision surprised him as much as it surprised his security team, but he insisted. He needed air, needed to move, needed to feel like a regular person for just an hour. The head of security reluctantly agreed but insisted on following at a distance, accepted the compromise. The streets of downtown were busy with the lunch crowd, professionals in suits hurrying to grab food before their next meeting, tourists stopping to take photos, street vendors calling out their offerings. Pulled his collar up and walked with purpose, not really sure where he was heading but enjoying the anonymity of being just another face in the crowd. He turned down a side street he'd never explored before, drawn by the quieter atmosphere and the small boutiques and cafes that lined the narrow road. This was a part of the city he never visited, too far from the business district and too ordinary for someone of his status. But today, ordinary felt appealing. Passed an art gallery and paused to glance in the window. The display featured abstract paintings in bold colors, not his usual taste, but something made him stop. Perhaps it was the need to delay his return to the office, or perhaps it was genuine curiosity, but he found himself pushing open the door and stepping inside. The gallery was small but well-appointed, with white walls and carefully positioned lighting that made each piece stand out. Soft classical music played in the background, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and paint. A young woman sat at a desk near the entrance, engrossed in a book. She looked up when entered and offered a polite smile before returning to her reading. No recognition, no fawning, no special treatment. It was refreshing. Wandered through the gallery, studying paintings that ranged from landscapes to portraits to pieces so abstract he couldn't determine what they were meant to represent. He appreciated art in theory, but had never taken the time to really understand it. The pieces in his home and office had been selected by an interior designer, chosen for how they complemented the space rather than for any emotional connection. As he moved deeper into the gallery, entered a smaller room at the back. The lighting here was different, more intimate, and the walls held a different kind of work. These were photographs, large-scale prints in black and white, each one capturing a moment of raw human emotion. A child's laughter, an elderly couple holding hands, a dancer mid-leap, a woman's tears. stopped in front of one particular photograph. It showed a woman sitting on a park bench, her face turned toward the camera but her eyes looking somewhere beyond it. There was something haunting about her expression, a mixture of sadness and hope, of strength and vulnerability. The composition was perfect, the lighting ethereal, but it was her face that held captive. He stared at the photograph, trying to understand why it affected him so deeply. The woman wasn't classically beautiful in the way the models and actresses in his social circle were beautiful. Her features were softer, more real. But there was an authenticity to her that drew him in, made him want to know her story, understand what she was thinking in that captured moment. Stood there for what felt like a long time, lost in contemplation, until a voice behind him broke the spell. "She's something, isn't she?" Turned to find a man in his 60s standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, studying the same photograph with an expression of pride. The man was dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, his gray hair slightly disheveled, his face lined with years of laughter and life. He had the look of an artist, someone who saw the world differently than most people did, nodded in agreement. "It's a remarkable photograph. The emotion in her face is so genuine." The older man smiled. "That's my daughter. I'm Thomas, the photographer. This is my collection." He extended his hand and shook it, introducing himself simply as, leaving off his last name. Thomas showed no sign of recognizing him, which found both surprising and delightful. They talked about photography, about the challenges of capturing genuine emotion, about the difference between seeing and truly observing. Thomas explained that he'd been a professional photographer for 40 years, working everything from weddings to war zones, but his true passion was candid street photography, catching people in unguarded moments. Asked about the woman in the photograph, the one who had stopped him in his tracks, Thomas's expression softened with obvious affection. "That's Sarah, my daughter. I took that in the park near our house about 3 years ago. She didn't know I was photographing her. She'd been going through a difficult time, and I found her sitting there one morning just thinking. I almost didn't take the shot, felt like I was invading her privacy, but something told me I needed to capture that moment." He paused, looking at the photograph with a father's love. She was deciding something important that day. I could see it in her face, the way she was wrestling with herself. Later, she told me she'd been thinking about whether to follow her heart or follow the practical path everyone expected of her. That moment on that bench was when she chose to follow her heart. Felt something stir in his chest, an unfamiliar tightness. When was the last time he'd followed his heart? Had he ever? His entire life had been about following the practical path, making the smart decision, building the empire. What did she choose? He found himself asking. Thomas chuckled. She became a teacher, not as glamorous or lucrative as the law career everyone expected, but she loves it. Works at an elementary school in a rough neighborhood, makes a difference in kids' lives every day. She's happy, and that's all that matters to me. They continued talking and learned that Thomas had opened this gallery 5 years ago after his wife passed away. It was a dream they'd shared, and he'd fulfilled it in her honor. The gallery barely broke even, but it wasn't about the money. It was about sharing art with people who truly appreciated it, about creating a space where beauty and emotion could exist without commercial pressure. Found himself envying this man who had so little compared to him in material terms, but seemed so rich in the things that actually mattered. Thomas had purpose, passion, love for his work, and a daughter who chose happiness over prestige. Had billions but couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuinely happy. As they talked, his eyes kept drifting back to Sarah's photograph. There was something about her that wouldn't let him go, a pull he couldn't explain and didn't entirely understand. Thomas noticed and smiled knowingly. "You keep looking at that one. It affects a lot of people that way. There's something universal about her expression, I think. We've all been where she was at some point, standing at a crossroads, trying to figure out which way to go." Nodded slowly. He was at a crossroads now, wasn't he? He just hadn't admitted it to himself until this moment. His life looked perfect from the outside, but inside he was hollow. He'd built everything he thought he wanted and found it wanting. Thomas excused himself to help another customer who had entered the gallery, leaving alone with the photographs. He moved around the room, studying each one, but kept returning to Sarah's image. Finally, he pulled out his phone and checked the time. He'd been in the gallery for over an hour. The 2 o'clock conference call had already started without him, and he had a dozen missed calls from Jennifer. For the first time in his professional life, didn't care. Let them wait. Let them wonder where he was. This moment felt more important than any business deal, though he couldn't have explained why if asked. When Thomas returned, asked about purchasing the photograph of Sarah. Thomas looked surprised, then thoughtful. "That one's not for sale, I'm afraid. It's too personal, but I have prints of some of my other work if you're interested." Felt an unexpected disappointment, but understood. If he had an image that precious of someone he loved, he wouldn't sell it either. He ended up purchasing 3 other photographs from the collection, writing a check that made Thomas's eyes widen slightly, though the older man was too polite to comment on the amount. As prepared to leave, Thomas handed him a business card. "Come back anytime. I'm here most days, and I always enjoy talking with someone who actually looks at the art instead of just glancing at price tags." The comment made wonder if Thomas had recognized him after all, but the older man's expression remained open and friendly, with no hint of calculation. Thanked him and stepped back out onto the street, the wrapped photographs tucked under his arm. His security team, who had been waiting patiently outside, fell into step behind him as he walked back toward his office building. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, and the city seemed different somehow, more vibrant, more real. By the time returned to his office, it was nearly 4 o'clock. Jennifer met him at the elevator with an expression that mixed relief with exasperation. "Mr. Wellington, the conference call, the investors, they've been waiting. Mr. Harrison handled it, but he wasn't happy about it." Waved off her concerns. "It's fine. Send my apologies and tell them something came up. Clear my schedule for the rest of the day." Jennifer looked shocked, never cleared his schedule. He worked until 7 or 8 every night, often took calls from home until midnight. But today he wanted to leave, needed to leave. He spent the rest of the afternoon in his office with the door closed, looking at the photographs he'd purchased, thinking about Thomas and his life of purpose, thinking about Sarah and her choice to follow her heart. He thought about their marriage that was really a merger, about the life they'd built together that looked perfect but felt empty. When finally left the office at 5:30, his entire executive team was stunned. He ignored their surprised expressions and headed home, something he almost never did at such an early hour. The drive to his estate in the suburbs took 40 minutes, time usually spent on phone calls or reviewing documents. Today, he spent it staring out the window, watching the city give way to affluent neighborhoods, thinking about everything and nothing. The Wellington estate sprawled across 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. The house itself was a modern architectural masterpiece, all glass and steel and clean lines, featured in design magazines and by his peers. Pulled through the gates and up the long driveway, parking in front of the main entrance instead of pulling into the garage as he usually did. Inside, the house was quiet, wouldn't be home for hours. She spent most of her time at her foundation's office or having lunch with her society friends. Their housekeeper, Mrs., greeted him with surprise. "Mr. Wellington, you're home early. Can I get you anything?" Declined and headed upstairs to his study, the one room in the house that felt truly his. He unwrapped the photographs and considered where to hang them, settling on the wall opposite his desk. He'd have to remove the abstract piece that currently hung there, but he wouldn't miss it. As he worked to hang the new pieces, heard his phone buzzing with messages and emails. He ignored them all, focused on getting the photographs positioned just right. When he finished, he stepped back to examine his work. The photographs transformed the room, brought life and emotion to a space that had been as sterile and impersonal as his office. But it was the memory of the photograph he couldn't buy that stayed with him. Sarah's face, her expression of someone standing at a crossroads, choosing between what was expected and what felt right. Wondered what it would feel like to make that choice, to value happiness over success, to follow his heart instead of his carefully constructed plan. He was still standing there, lost in thought, when arrived home around 8. She knocked on his study door, something she rarely did since they each respected the other's private space. When called for her to enter, she stepped inside with a curious expression. "You're home early. Jennifer called to check if you were feeling all right." Looked as immaculate as always, dressed in a designer suit, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, her makeup perfect. She was beautiful in the way a sculpture was beautiful, admirable but untouchable. Studied his wife as if seeing her for the first time, or perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time in years. "I'm fine," he said simply. "Just needed a change of pace." Nodded, accepting his explanation without further question. That was their relationship in a nutshell. Surface-level pleasantries, no deeper investigation, no real curiosity about each other's inner lives. She glanced at the new photographs on his wall, her expression politely interested but not engaged. New art. confirmed and made an appropriate comment about them being nice before excusing herself to change for dinner. They had a charity event that evening, something had completely forgotten about. The thought of putting on a tuxedo, making small talk with other wealthy couples, pretending everything was perfect, suddenly felt unbearable. "I'm not going tonight," said, surprising himself as much as, "Tell them I'm not feeling well. You can go without me if you want, or we can skip it entirely." His perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. Never skipped events. Their social calendar was as carefully maintained as their business calendars, each appearance strategic, each connection valuable. "Are you sure? It's the museum gala. We're major donors. They'll expect us." Was sure. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was completely sure about something that had nothing to do with business or strategy or maintaining his image. He wanted to stay home, wanted to sit with his thoughts, wanted to figure out what the tightness in his chest meant and why a photograph of a stranger had affected him so deeply. Studied him for a long moment and wondered if she could see the change in him, if she sensed that something fundamental had shifted during his walk through an unfamiliar part of the city. But whatever she saw or sensed, she kept to herself. "All right, I'll make our excuses. Are you hungry? Should I have Mrs. prepare something?" The conversation was so polite, so distant, two acquaintances discussing dinner plans rather than a married couple concerned about each other. Declined, saying he'd grab something later. Nodded and left, closing the study door softly behind her. Alone again, returned to contemplating the photographs on his wall. In just one day, his carefully ordered world had tilted slightly off its axis. He'd skipped meetings, left work early, bought art on impulse, and now he was canceling a major social obligation. Small rebellions, perhaps, but for Wellington, they were revolutionary. He thought about Thomas, about his small gallery and his pride in his daughter's choices. He thought about Sarah, choosing happiness over prestige, following her heart to a rough elementary school instead of a prestigious law firm. He thought about the life he'd built, brick by brick, deal by deal, until he'd constructed a prison of success that looked like a palace from the outside. The question that haunted him as he sat in his study, staring at photographs of genuine human emotion, was simple but profound. When had he lost himself? At what point had Wellington the person been completely subsumed by Wellington the billionaire? And more importantly, was it too late to find his way back? Outside his study window, the sun set over his manicured grounds, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Watched the light change, feeling something shift inside him, something that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten it existed. It felt like the beginning of something, though he couldn't say what. All he knew was that his life before this day and his life after it would be fundamentally different, separated by a single hour in a small art gallery and a photograph of a woman he'd never met. Tomorrow he would return to the gallery. He wasn't sure why, wasn't sure what he hoped to find there, but he knew he had to go back. Something had started today, and Wellington, who built his empire on seeing opportunities others missed, recognized this as the most important opportunity of his life. Not a business opportunity, but a chance to remember what it felt like to be human, to feel something real, to want something he couldn't buy. As night fell over the Wellington estate, sat in his study, looking at his new photographs, thinking about crossroads and choices, about following your heart versus following the expected path. He'd spent his entire adult life on the expected path, and it had brought him everything except happiness. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to take a different road, even if he had no idea where it led. The decision settled over him like a weight lifting rather than descending. Tomorrow, he would go back to the gallery. Tomorrow, he would start asking different questions. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey of figuring out who Wellington was when you stripped away the billions and the empire and the image. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and for the first time in years, Wellington felt truly alive, woke up the next morning with a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The sun was barely rising, painting his bedroom in soft golden light, but he was wide awake, his mind already planning the day ahead. Was still asleep in her separate bedroom down the hall, an arrangement they'd settled into 2 years ago under the guise of not disturbing each other's sleep schedules. In reality, it was just another way they'd drifted apart, adding physical distance to the emotional distance that already existed between them. He went through his usual morning routine with one significant difference. Instead of putting on one of his custom-tailored suits, chose casual clothes from the back of his closet, items he'd bought years ago but rarely wore. Dark jeans, a simple button-down shirt, a leather jacket. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he almost didn't recognize the man staring back. He looked younger somehow, less rigid, more approachable. Downstairs, Mrs. was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw how was dressed, but she was too professional to comment. She asked if he'd like his usual egg white omelet and fruit, but surprised her by asking for regular scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. Another small rebellion, but it felt significant. He'd been eating egg whites for years because his nutritionist recommended them, not because he actually preferred them. Ate breakfast in the informal dining room rather than the formal one, looking out at the gardens through the large windows. The grounds were beautiful, maintained by a team of groundskeepers who ensured every shrub was perfectly trimmed and every flower bed immaculately arranged. But there was something sterile about the perfection, something that felt more like a hotel than a home. When was the last time he'd actually walked through those gardens? When had he last stopped to smell the roses that cost a small fortune to maintain? He finished his breakfast and left the house before woke up, before Jennifer could call with his schedule, before anyone could ask questions or expect explanations. His driver was waiting, as always, but waved him off again. "I'll be driving myself today. Take the day off." The driver looked confused but accepted the unexpected gift. Climbed into one of the cars in his collection, a vintage he'd bought 3 years ago and driven maybe twice. The engine roared to life, and he felt a small thrill at the sound, at the feeling of being in control, of going somewhere because he chose to, not because it was scheduled. The drive into the city was different when he was behind the wheel. He noticed things he'd never seen before, neighborhoods he'd only ever glimpsed from the back seat of his town car while checking emails. The city was waking up, coffee shops opening, people heading to work, life happening all around him. Felt like he'd been asleep for years and was finally opening his eyes. He parked in a public garage near the gallery, something he'd never done before. Walking through the streets with no security detail following him felt liberating and slightly reckless. What if someone recognized him? What if someone approached him? But no one did. Without his usual entourage and designer suit, he was just another person on the sidewalk, invisible in the best possible way. The gallery wasn't open yet when arrived. According to the hours posted on the door, it wouldn't open for another 30 minutes. Found a coffee shop across the street and ordered a regular coffee, black, no fancy modifications. He sat by the window, watching the gallery entrance, feeling slightly ridiculous but unable to make himself leave. What was he doing here? What did he hope to accomplish? He'd bought photographs yesterday, met an interesting man, seen an image that moved him. That should have been the end of it. He should be in his office right now, making up for yesterday's unusual absence, reassuring his team that everything was normal. Instead, he was sitting in a coffee shop, waiting for an art gallery to open, acting like a person he barely recognized. When Thomas finally arrived to open the gallery, felt his pulse quicken. He waited a few more minutes, finishing his coffee, before crossing the street and entering. The bell above the door chimed, and Thomas looked up from where he was turning on lights and checking the positioning of a few pieces. "Wasn't it?" Thomas's face broke into a genuine smile. "Back so soon, couldn't stay away from the art." Returned the smile, feeling some of his nervous energy dissipate. "Something like that. I wanted to see the collection again. I was in a rush yesterday." Thomas nodded, gesturing around the gallery. "Take your time. I'll be here all day. Can I get you some coffee? I just made a pot in the back." They ended up sitting in Thomas's small office behind the main gallery space, drinking coffee that was far better than expected, talking about art and life and everything in between. Thomas had stories from his decades of photography, tales of capturing historical moments and ordinary miracles, of the people he'd met and the places he'd seen. Found himself sharing things he hadn't talked about in years, maybe ever. He talked about the pressure of his father's expectations, how he'd built his business to prove something to a man who died before seeing his son's success. He talked about the emptiness of achievement when there was no one to truly share it with, about waking up every day to a life that looked perfect but felt hollow. He didn't mention his name or his wealth specifically, but Thomas seemed to understand without being told. The older man listened without judgment, nodding in places, offering insights that came from genuine wisdom rather than textbook psychology. "I think a lot of people reach a point where they realize the life they built isn't the life they actually wanted," Thomas said. "The question is what you do with that realization. Some people ignore it, push it down, keep going through the motions. Others use it as a catalyst for change." Cradled his coffee cup, considering the words. What if you've built something so big, so complex, that change seems impossible? What if your life affects too many other people to just walk away? Thomas smiled, the expression both kind and knowing. Who said anything about walking away? Change doesn't have to mean destruction. Sometimes it just means adding something new, finding balance, remembering the parts of yourself you set aside. You don't have to burn down the forest to plant new trees. They talked for over an hour, and when finally stood to leave, he felt lighter somehow. Thomas walked him to the door, and just before left, the older man said, "My daughter comes by sometimes to help out at the gallery. If you're around on Thursday afternoon, you might meet her. I think you'd like her." Felt that same inexplicable pull from yesterday, the same strange magnetism toward someone he'd never met. He found himself agreeing to return on Thursday, knowing it was probably a mistake, knowing he was walking toward something he couldn't control or predict. But for once, he didn't care about control. He just cared about following this feeling wherever it led. The rest of Tuesday passed in a blur. Went to his office, sat through meetings, made decisions that would affect thousands of people and millions of dollars. But part of his mind was elsewhere, thinking about Thursday, about the possibility of meeting the woman from the photograph. It was absurd. He was a married billionaire with responsibilities and obligations. She was a teacher, living a completely different life in a completely different world. There was no rational reason for him to be so drawn to someone he'd only seen in a photograph. But rationality seemed to be taking a backseat to something deeper, something had ignored for so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. Intuition, feeling, the whisper of something important trying to get his attention. Wednesday was worse. Was distracted during a crucial negotiation, something his team definitely noticed, though they were too polite to comment. He left the office early again, driving aimlessly through the city, past neighborhoods he'd never explored, seeing his city as if for the first time. He drove past schools and playgrounds, past small houses with toys in the yard and lived in gardens, past the kind of ordinary life he'd never experienced. That evening mentioned that she'd be away for the weekend, flying to New York for a charity event and to visit friends. Realized he couldn't remember the last time they'd actually spent a weekend together. They lived parallel lives that occasionally intersected for social obligations, but that was all. He wondered if she was as lonely as he was, or if she'd found contentment in this arrangement. "Have a good trip," said and nodded, already focused on her phone, planning her time away. They were in the same room but miles apart, and wondered if either of them would notice if the other one disappeared. The thought should have been devastating, but instead it was just sad, a quiet acknowledgement of a marriage that had died so gradually they'd both missed the funeral. Thursday arrived with agonizing slowness. Tried to focus on work, but by noon he'd given up pretending. He told Jennifer he had an off-site meeting and wouldn't be back for the rest of the day. She looked like she wanted to ask questions but refrained. Behavior this week had been so out of character that his entire staff was clearly concerned, but no one dared to confront him directly. Arrived at the gallery at 2 in the afternoon. His hands were actually shaking slightly as he pushed open the door, a physical response he couldn't remember experiencing before. Nervousness was not an emotion Wellington usually dealt with. He negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but the possibility of meeting an elementary school teacher had his heart racing. Thomas was helping a customer when entered, so he wandered through the gallery, pretending to study the artwork while actually just trying to calm himself down. This was ridiculous. He was acting like a teenager, not a grown man with responsibilities. He should leave, go back to his office, stop this before it went any further. But he didn't leave. He stayed, moving from painting to photograph to sculpture, not really seeing any of it, just waiting. The customer finally left and Thomas spotted. "Perfect timing," the older man said with a smile. "Sarah should be here any minute. She's helping me catalog some new pieces that came in." As if summoned by her name, the gallery door opened, and a woman walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop across the street. Turned, and his breath caught in his throat. It was her, the woman from the photograph, but alive, moving, real. She was dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup that he could see. She looked nothing like the women in his usual social circle with their designer clothes and perfectly styled hair, and she was more beautiful than any of them. Sarah didn't notice at first. She was talking to her father about one of the students at her school, laughing about something funny that had happened in class. Her laugh was genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh that came from real joy rather than social politeness. Found himself mesmerized, rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Thomas called her over. Sarah, I want you to meet someone. He bought several pieces earlier this week and has been back to visit. Sarah turned toward him, and their eyes met for the first time. Felt the impact of her gaze like a physical force. Her eyes were hazel, he noticed, flecked with gold and green, expressive and intelligent and kind. Nice to meet you, Sarah said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm but warm and held on perhaps a moment too long before catching himself and letting go. He tried to say something appropriate, something normal, but his usually sharp mind had gone completely blank. All he could manage was, "Your father's work is remarkable. The collection is really impressive." Sarah smiled and felt something in his chest tighten. "Dad's talented, but I'm biased. Are you a collector? Do you have a gallery of your own?" Explained that he was new to seriously collecting art, that he'd wandered into the gallery by chance and been moved by what he saw. He kept his explanation vague, still not revealing who he was, enjoying the novelty of being treated like a regular person. Sarah listened with genuine interest, asking questions about what drew him to particular pieces, sharing her own favorites from her father's collection. They talked for a few minutes, just casual conversation, but felt more engaged than he had in any conversation in recent memory. Sarah had a way of really listening, of asking questions that showed she cared about the answers. There was no agenda, no networking, no social calculation. She was simply present, simply herself, and it was intoxicating. Thomas excused himself to handle a phone call, leaving and Sarah alone in the gallery. The moment should have been awkward, but instead, it felt natural. Sarah showed him some of the new pieces that had arrived, explaining what she liked about each one, asking his opinion, actually caring what he thought rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. "So what do you do when you're not buying art?" Sarah asked, her tone conversational and friendly. It was such a simple question, the kind people asked each other all the time, but found himself struggling to answer. What did he do? He worked. He made money. He attended events, but what did he actually do that mattered? "I work in business," he said finally, keeping it vague. "Investment mostly, it's not very interesting." The lie felt necessary. If she knew who he was, everything would change. People always changed when they knew. Sarah nodded. "My dad always says the most interesting people are the ones who think they're boring. What do you do for fun?" Another simple question that shouldn't have been difficult to answer, but realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd done something purely for fun. "I'm figuring that out," he admitted. "I used to enjoy photography, actually, before my work took over my life. Seeing your father's work has made me think about picking it up again." The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from art to teaching to the city they both lived in but experienced so differently. Sarah talked about her students with obvious affection, sharing stories that were funny and touching and frustrating in turn. She clearly loved what she did, even though it was challenging and often thankless. "Why teaching?" asked. "Your father mentioned you considered law school." Sarah's expression turned thoughtful. "I did. Everyone expected me to become a lawyer. Good money, prestige, family tradition. My grandfather was a judge, my uncle's a partner at a big firm. It would have been the safe choice." "But you didn't choose it." "No, I didn't. I student taught one semester in college, and I fell in love with it. Seeing kids learn, seeing them grow, making a difference in their lives, even in small ways. It felt real in a way that studying corporate law never did. So I chose teaching, and I've never regretted it." Thought about his own choices, the ones he'd made for practical reasons, for family expectations, for building his empire. Had he ever chosen something simply because it felt right? "Your father told me you made that decision sitting on a park bench. That's when he took the photograph of you, the one in the gallery." Sarah looked surprised, then smiled. "He told you about that? Yeah, that was a heavy morning. I was sitting there trying to convince myself to do the sensible thing, apply to law school, make everyone proud. But I kept thinking about my students, these kids who needed good teachers, who needed someone to believe in them. And I realized that if I didn't believe in myself enough to follow my own path, how could I teach them to believe in themselves?" The wisdom in her words hit like a punch to the gut. How could he expect his employees to be innovative and take risks when he'd built his entire life on playing it safe, on following the expected path? How could he claim to be living when he'd spent years going through the motions of a life that looked good but felt empty? They talked for nearly 2 hours and lost track of time completely. At some point, Thomas returned and worked quietly in the background, smiling to himself as he watched his daughter and this mysterious visitor connect. Other customers came and went, but barely noticed. He was completely absorbed in Sarah, in her stories, her laugh, the way she gesticulated when she got excited about something, the passion in her voice when she talked about her students. Finally, Sarah checked her watch and made a sound of surprise. "I didn't realize how late it was. I have a stack of papers to grade tonight and a lesson plan to finish." She turned to with an apologetic smile. "It was really nice talking with you. I hope you'll come back to the gallery. Dad loves having visitors who actually appreciate the art." Wanted to ask for her number, wanted to suggest they continue the conversation over dinner, wanted to find any excuse to see her again. But he couldn't. He was married, regardless of how empty that marriage had become. He had no right to pursue this, no matter how alive she made him feel. So instead, he just said, "I will. I'll definitely come back." And he meant it, even though he knew he probably shouldn't, even though he knew he was walking into territory that could only lead to complications. Sarah said goodbye to her father and left and felt the gallery dim with her departure. Thomas came to stand beside him, both of them looking at the door she'd just walked through. "She's special, isn't she?" the older man said quietly. Nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Special didn't begin to cover it. In just 2 hours, Sarah had made him feel more real, more himself than he'd felt in years. She'd reminded him that there was more to life than quarterly reports and board meetings, that genuine connection was possible, that he didn't have to be Wellington the billionaire. He could just be a person who liked photography and good conversation, and the way a particular woman's eyes lit up when she talked about something she loved. "She has that effect on people," Thomas continued. "Always has, even as a kid. She sees the good in everyone, believes in people even when they don't believe in themselves. Her students are lucky to have her." Thought about the children in Sarah's classroom, kids from a rough neighborhood who had a teacher who genuinely cared about them, who chose to be there even though she could have done anything else. He thought about the impact she must have, the lives she was changing one day at a time, one child at a time. It was more meaningful than anything he'd done with his billions. He left the gallery shortly after, walking back to his car in a daze. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, and the city seemed brighter somehow, more vibrant. Sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand the magnitude of the shift occurring inside him. He'd met someone who saw him as just a person, not as a bank account or a business opportunity or a stepping stone to success. He'd had a conversation that mattered, that touched on real things, that left him feeling energized rather than drained. He'd remembered what it felt like to be interested in someone, genuinely curious about their thoughts and dreams and daily life. And it terrified him because he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't have her. She was everything his life wasn't: authentic, purposeful, grounded, real. She chose teaching over law because it mattered to her, not because it would impress anyone. She lived in a world where people connected over shared passions rather than shared portfolios. She was completely and utterly out of his reach, separated by more than just the fact that he was married. They lived in different worlds, operated by different rules, valued different things. But knowing he couldn't have her didn't stop from wanting her. It didn't stop him from replaying their conversation in his mind over and over, remembering the way she laughed, the passion in her voice when she talked about her work, the genuine kindness in her eyes. It didn't stop him from feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, truly and completely alive. Drove home as the sun began to set, knowing his life had changed irrevocably. He'd been sleepwalking through his existence, and Sarah had woken him up. The question now was what he was going to do about it. Could he go back to sleep, return to the comfortable numbness of his old life? Or had he been awakened in a way that couldn't be undone? The Wellington estate came into view, its modern lines and perfect landscaping looking more like a museum than a home. Pulled through the gates, parked in front of the house, and sat there for a moment, gathering himself. Inside was, or maybe not since she'd mentioned possibly leaving early for New York. Inside was Mrs. and the household staff, maintaining a home that never felt lived in. Inside was his study with the photographs that had started all of this, images of real emotion in a house that felt devoid of it. Climbed out of the car and headed inside, already planning his return to the gallery. He knew it was wrong. He knew he should stop this before it went any further. He knew he was married, had responsibilities, couldn't just chase after a feeling like some lovesick teenager. But he also knew with certainty that came from somewhere deep in his gut that Sarah represented something important, something he needed to understand even if he could never have it. That night, alone in his study with already in New York, looked at the photographs on his wall and made a decision. He would go back to the gallery. He would see Sarah again if she was there. He wouldn't pursue anything inappropriate, but he wouldn't deny himself the chance to feel alive, to have real conversations, to remember what it was like to connect with another human being on a genuine level. It was a small decision in many ways, just choosing to visit an art gallery to talk to a teacher to allow himself to feel something. But knew it was also huge. A crack in the carefully constructed walls, the following weeks developed a pattern that knew was dangerous but couldn't seem to stop. He found himself at Thomas's gallery 2 or 3 times a week, always with some excuse. He was interested in buying more art, he said. He was learning about photography, he claimed. He was just in the neighborhood, he insisted. Thomas never questioned these excuses, just welcomed with genuine warmth and made him coffee in the small office behind the gallery. Sometimes Sarah was there, sometimes she wasn't. Told himself he didn't plan his visits around her schedule, but that was a lie he couldn't quite sell even to himself. On the days she appeared, usually Thursday afternoons and sometimes Saturdays when she didn't have papers to grade, the whole gallery seemed to light up. They would talk for hours, conversations that ranged from trivial to profound, from silly to serious, covering everything and nothing. Learned that Sarah loved old movies, especially black and white films from the 40s and 50s. She could quote entire scenes from Casablanca and It's a Wonderful Life. She loved jazz music but couldn't carry a tune to save her life. She was terrified of spiders but had once rescued a stray dog in the pouring rain and brought it home despite her apartment's no-pets policy. She kept the dog, named him Cooper, and eventually won over her landlord with sheer persistence. She learned things about too, though he was careful to keep certain details vague. She knew he'd grown up with high expectations, that he'd lost his father young, that he sometimes felt trapped by the life he'd built. She knew he was married, he'd mentioned in passing once when explaining why he couldn't meet up for coffee on a weekend. Sarah had nodded, her expression neutral, and hadn't asked for details. The subject of his marriage became something they both carefully avoided, a minefield neither wanted to navigate. What didn't tell her, what he carefully concealed, was the extent of his wealth and fame. He paid for purchases in cash when possible, never used credit cards with his name on them. He continued to dress casually when visiting the gallery, keeping his designer suits and luxury watches locked away. Thomas knew something of his circumstances, was sure, but the older man respected his privacy and never pressed for information. The problem was that double life was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. At work, his distraction was noticed. In a meeting with his executive team, his CFO had to repeat a question 3 times before heard him. During a conference call with investors in Tokyo, zoned out completely, his mind replaying a conversation he'd had with Sarah about her students. Jennifer started giving him concerned looks, and even his security team noticed his unusual behavior. Noticed, too, though her concern seemed more about appearances than genuine worry. She'd returned from New York talking about the rumors she'd heard, whispers that Wellington was behaving strangely, skipping meetings, leaving the office at odd hours. "People are talking," she said over dinner one evening, one of the rare times they actually ate together. "Your team is worried. What's going on?" Looked at his wife across the expanse of their formal dining table, at least 15 feet separating them even when they were sharing a meal. She looked concerned, but in the detached way someone might be concerned about a business partner's erratic behavior. There was no real intimacy in her question, no genuine connection. "I'm fine," he said, "just reassessing some priorities." Frowned. "Priorities? You've built an empire. You can't just lose focus because you're having some kind of midlife crisis." The words were harsh, but her tone was more exasperated than cruel. This was who they were to each other now, business partners trying to maintain an investment. "Is that what you think this is? A midlife crisis?" asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Set down her fork and studied him. "I don't know what else to call it. You're acting completely out of character. You're buying art from galleries I've never heard of, driving yourself places instead of using the car service, wearing jeans to the office. The board is starting to ask questions." Felt a flash of anger, rare for him. "The board can ask all the questions they want. I'm still running the company effectively. Profits are up. Our portfolio is solid. Every metric that matters is trending in the right direction. What I do with my personal time is my own business." "Not when it affects Wellington Industries," countered. "Not when people start wondering if the CEO is mentally stable. You have responsibilities, to the company, to the employees, to the shareholders. You can't just check out because you're bored or restless or whatever this is." The argument continued for a while, going nowhere, both of them retreating to familiar positions. Saw everything through the lens of the business and their social standing. was beginning to see that there was more to life than business and social standing. They were speaking different languages, and neither could understand the other. Finally stood up, his dinner barely touched. "I have work to do," he said, though it was a lie. He had nothing to do but couldn't sit at that table pretending anymore. Nodded, already turning her attention to her phone, their argument forgotten or at least set aside. This was their pattern, brief conflicts that went nowhere, followed by a return to polite distance. Retreated to his study and looked at the photographs on his wall. The ones he'd bought from Thomas had become a kind of sanctuary, a reminder that real emotion existed, that life could be more than what he'd made of it. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at Thomas's number. They'd exchanged numbers weeks ago, ostensibly so could check the gallery hours or ask about new pieces. In reality, it was a lifeline, a connection to a world that felt more real than his own. He texted Thomas asking if the gallery would be open tomorrow afternoon. The response came quickly. "Always open for you, my friend. Sarah will be here too, if that matters." Smiled despite himself. Thomas saw more than gave him credit for. The older man understood what was happening, even if no one had spoken the words aloud. The next afternoon, cleared his schedule despite Jennifer's protests and drove to the gallery. He was taking bigger risks now, caring less about being seen or recognized. Part of him almost wanted to be discovered, wanted the whole charade to end. The secrecy was exhausting, and he was tired of living two separate lives. When he arrived, the gallery was quiet. Thomas was in the back, and Sarah was sitting on the floor in front of a collection of photographs spread out around her. She looked up when the bell chimed, her face breaking into a smile when she saw. That smile did something to him every time, made his chest tighten and his heart race like he was a teenager instead of a 42-year-old billionaire. "Hey," she said, gesturing to the photographs around her. "Help me pick which ones to include in Dad's next show. I can't decide." Sat down on the floor beside her, something he couldn't remember doing in years. His custom suit pants protested the position, but he didn't care. They went through the photographs together, debating the merits of each one, discussing composition and emotion and technical skill. Sarah had a good eye, discovered. She understood the art even though she wasn't an artist herself. "This one," said, holding up a photograph of an elderly man playing chess in a park. "There's something about his expression, like he's seeing 10 moves ahead, but also remembering games from 50 years ago." Sarah took the photograph, studying it closely. "You see that too? Everyone else thinks this one's too simple, but I love it, the way Dad captured the concentration and the nostalgia at the same time." She looked at with those hazel eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "You have a good eye for this. Have you thought about taking it up seriously? Photography, I mean." Had thought about it, actually. Late at night in his study, looking at his new photographs, he'd remembered the joy he used to feel capturing moments, seeing the world through a lens. "Maybe," he said. "It's been a long time. I'm not sure I'd be any good anymore." "The best time to start was years ago," Sarah said with a grin. "The second best time is now. That's what I tell my students when they say they're too far behind to catch up." They continued sorting through photographs, their shoulders almost touching, the casual intimacy of the moment both thrilling and terrifying for. He was hyper-aware of her proximity, of the faint scent of her shampoo, of the way her hands moved as she gestured. He wanted to reach out to touch her hand, to close the small distance between them. But he didn't. He couldn't. He was married, and she deserved better than to be someone's escape from an unhappy marriage. Thomas emerged from the back room with sandwiches and sodas. "Thought you two might be hungry," he said, setting the food down beside them. The older man had a knowing look in his eyes, but he didn't comment on finding them sitting on the floor together like college students instead of a teacher and a businessman. They ate and talked, and somewhere in the conversation, Sarah mentioned an upcoming exhibition at the city's Museum of Modern Art. "I try to go to the opening nights," she said. "It's a good way to see new work and support the artists. This one looks amazing, a whole collection focused on urban landscapes. Are you interested in that kind of thing?" Was interested in anything that would give him another chance to see her, but he kept his answer casual. "Sounds interesting. When is it?" "Next Friday at 7. It's open to the public so anyone can go. I'll probably be there around 7:30 after I finish grading papers." She paused, then added, "You should come if you're free. It would be fun to see it with someone who actually appreciates art instead of just going through the motions." It was an invitation, casual and friendly, nothing inappropriate about it. Two people who shared an interest in art, planning to attend a public event, but felt the weight of it, the significance. This would be the first time they'd met anywhere other than the gallery, the first time they'd be somewhere together in public where he might be recognized. He should say no, he should make an excuse, should keep their interactions limited to the safety of Thomas's gallery where he could control the environment. But he couldn't make himself say no. "I'd like that," he heard himself say. "I'll be there." Sarah's smile was radiant and felt both elated and guilty. He was crossing a line, he knew it. Nothing had happened, nothing inappropriate, but his intentions weren't entirely pure. He wanted to see her, wanted to spend time with her, wanted something he had no right to want. The rest of the week dragged by, went through the motions at work, attended meetings, made decisions, maintained the facade of normalcy. But his mind was elsewhere, counting down the days until Friday. Was busy with her own schedule, barely home, which made things easier. Didn't have to explain or justify or pretend as much. On Friday afternoon, left the office early despite having a late meeting scheduled. Jennifer looked like she might object, but something in his expression stopped her. He drove home, showered, and stood in his closet trying to decide what to wear. It was ridiculous, this anxiety over clothes, like he was getting ready for a first date, but he wanted to look good without looking like he was trying too hard. He settled on dark jeans, a crisp white shirt, and a sport coat, casual but put together. Was in New York again, another charity thing, or maybe visiting friends. Had stopped keeping track of her schedule. He left a note for Mrs. saying he'd be out for the evening and drove into the city. He arrived at the museum at 7:45, deliberately a little late so he wouldn't be waiting obviously for Sarah. The exhibition was crowded, well-dressed people moving through the galleries with wine glasses in hand, studying the large-scale photographs of city scenes from around the world. Got a glass of wine he didn't want and wandered through, looking at the art but really looking for Sarah. He found her in the third gallery, standing in front of a massive photograph of New York City at night, the lights creating a sea of gold and white against the darkness. She was wearing a simple black dress and had her hair down for the first time since had known her. She looked beautiful, elegant in an understated way that had nothing to do with designer labels or expensive jewelry. Approached, his heart hammering in his chest in a way that was becoming familiar around her. "Sarah." She turned and her face lit up when she saw him. "I'm so glad you came, isn't this incredible?" She gestured to the photograph. "Look at how he captured the energy of the city. You can almost hear the noise, feel the crowds." They moved through the exhibition together, discussing each piece, debating the merits of different compositions, sharing their favorites. Other people drifted around them, conversations and laughter filling the space, but was aware only of Sarah, of her insights and observations, of the way she leaned in to point out details in the photographs. At some point, realized people were watching them. He saw heads turn, heard whispers, noticed the way eyes followed him. Recognition was dawning. Here, at a high-profile art opening, dressed like himself instead of in the casual clothes he wore to the gallery, he looked like Wellington, Billionaire. And he was with a woman who very obviously wasn't his wife. Sarah noticed too. "People are starring," she said quietly. "Is that normal for you?" Felt the moment of truth arriving, the one he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. He could lie, could brush it off, could keep maintaining the fiction, or he could tell her the truth. "Let's go somewhere we can talk," he said. "Somewhere quieter." They left the exhibition and walked to a small park across the street. The evening was warm, the sky deepening into twilight, the city lights beginning to sparkle. They sat on a bench, the same kind of bench where Thomas had photographed Sarah making her choice between law school and teaching. Took a deep breath. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am." Sarah looked at him, her expression patient and open. "I know." "You know, I figured it out a couple weeks ago. Someone at school mentioned seeing Wellington at an art gallery downtown, and I put it together. Wellington Industries, right? The tech conglomerate." Her tone was matter of fact, no awe or judgment, just acknowledgement. Felt relief and anxiety warring inside him. "Why didn't you say anything?" Sarah shrugged. "Because you clearly didn't want to talk about it. I figured you had your reasons for keeping it quiet. We all have parts of ourselves we don't share right away." She paused, then asked, "Why did you keep it secret?" Struggled to find the right words. "Because when people know who I am, what I'm worth, everything changes. They see dollar signs instead of a person. Every conversation becomes calculated, every interaction has an agenda. With you and Thomas, I got to just be, not Wellington billionaire CEO, just who likes photography and good conversation. I haven't felt that way in longer than I can remember." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this. And your wife, the one you mentioned once and then never brought up again. The question hung between them, the elephant they'd both been carefully avoiding. Felt the weight of it, the complexity of his situation crashing down. Her name is, we've been married for 5 years, it's complicated. Complicated how? Looked out at the park, at families walking dogs and couples strolling hand in hand, at normal people living normal lives. It's a marriage on paper more than anything else. We live separate lives, have separate interests, barely see each other. It's been that way for years. We're business partners more than spouses. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. I need to be clear about something. I like you. I enjoy our conversations. I think you're interesting and kind and clearly going through something important. But I don't date married men, complicated or not. I've seen what that does to people, the damage it causes. I won't be that person. The words hurt even though had known they were coming, even though they were exactly what Sarah should say. I understand, he said. I'm not asking you to be. I shouldn't have come tonight. I shouldn't have let this go as far as it has. Being around you makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. But that's not your responsibility, and it's not fair to you. They sat in silence, the truth settling over them like a heavy blanket. Had known this moment would come, had known there was no future for whatever this was between them. Sarah was too good, too principled, too aware of right and wrong to compromise herself, and he respected her for it, even as it broke something inside him. I think I should go, Sarah said finally, standing up. She looked down at, and there was sadness in her eyes, but also certainty. I think you need to figure out your life, really figure it out. Not because of me, but because you deserve to be happy. You deserve to live a life that's real, not just successful. But you can't do that while you're still married to someone you don't love, while you're still maintaining a facade. Stood too, knowing she was right, knowing this was goodbye even though the word wasn't spoken. I'm sorry, he said. I never meant to put you in this position. Sarah's smile was sad but genuine. I know, take care of yourself. I hope you find what you're looking for. She walked away and watched her go, feeling like something vital was walking away with her. She disappeared into the twilight and sank back onto the bench, his head in his hands. What had he been thinking? What had he been hopping for? A relationship with Sarah was impossible, not just because of his marriage, but because of who he was, the life he lived, the world he inhabited. They were from different universes that had briefly intersected, but gravity was pulling them back to their separate orbits. Sat on that bench for a long time, watching the sky darken, watching the park empty out, watching life continue around him while he felt frozen in place. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages and calls, but he ignored them all. For once, the business could wait. The empire could wait. Everything could wait while he tried to process what had just happened and what it meant for his future. Finally, as the park lights came on and a security guard began making rounds, stood and walked back to his car. He drove home on autopilot, barely seeing the road, his mind replaying the conversation with Sarah over and over. She told him to figure out his life, to choose happiness over success, to stop maintaining a facade. But how did he do that? How did he dismantle an empire, a marriage, a carefully constructed image that thousands of people depended on? The Wellington estate was dark when he arrived except for the exterior lighting that made the property look like a museum after hours. Let himself in, dismissed Mrs. who had waited up, and went straight to his study. He poured himself a drink, something he rarely did, and sat in front of the photographs on his wall, the ones that had started all of this. His phone rang. It was calling from New York, almost didn't answer, but habit and obligation won out. Hello. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all evening. His voice was tight with frustration. Someone sent me photos of you at the museum tonight at an art exhibition with a woman who definitely wasn't me. Care to explain? So it was starting already, the fallout from being seen in public with Sarah. Felt a strange calm settle over him. Her name is Sarah, she's a friend. We were looking at art together. A friend, repeated, her tone making it clear she didn't believe him. People are talking. Again, first the strange behavior at work, now this. What is going on with you? Took a sip of his drink, considering his answer. He could lie, could smooth it over, could return to the comfortable pattern of their marriage where they asked nothing real of each other. Or he could tell the truth, could start dismantling the facade right now. I met someone, he said finally. Nothing happened, nothing inappropriate, but I met someone who made me realize how empty our marriage has become, how empty my whole life has become, and I can't keep pretending anymore. I can't keep going through the motions of a marriage that died years ago. The silence on the other end of the phone was profound. When finally spoke, her voice was different, quieter, almost relieved. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to have a real conversation about our marriage, about whether we want to stay in it, about what we both actually want from our lives. We've been coasting for too long, both of us, maintaining an image instead of building something real." Another long silence, then said something that surprised him. "I agree, I'll be home Sunday night, we'll talk then," and she hung up. Sat in his study, his drink forgotten, staring at the photographs on his wall and thinking about Crossroads. Sarah had stood at one 3 years ago and chosen to follow her heart, was standing at his own crossroads now. The safe path was clear. Smooth things over with, distance himself from Sarah, return to his comfortable, empty life. The other path was murky and uncertain, involving difficult conversations and painful changes and no guarantee of happiness at the end. But as sat there in the darkness, surrounded by images of genuine emotion, he knew which path he had to choose. Sarah had woken him up, reminded him what it felt like to be truly alive. He couldn't go back to sleep now, couldn't return to sleepwalking through his existence. The empire would survive whatever changes came. The business would adapt. But Wellington the person, the man who'd been buried under Wellington the billionaire, needed to start living before it was too late. Tomorrow he would begin the process of figuring out his life, of dismantling the facade the weekend passed in a strange limbo. Stayed home, avoiding the office despite the dozens of calls and emails demanding his attention. He walked through the grounds of his estate, really seeing them for the first time in years. The gardens were beautiful but sterile, maintained by professionals to look perfect rather than grown with love. Everything about his life, he realized, had been curated for appearance rather than meaning. Saturday afternoon did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He drove to a camera shop in a neighborhood far from his usual haunts and bought a professional camera, the kind serious photographers used. The young clerk helped him select lenses and explained the features with obvious enthusiasm. Paid in cash and left with equipment that cost more than many people's cars, but for once, the expense felt worthwhile. This wasn't about acquiring another status symbol. This was about reclaiming a part of himself he'd buried. He spent the rest of Saturday afternoon driving around the city, stopping in neighborhoods he'd never visited, photographing people and places that caught his eye. An old man feeding pigeons in a park, a child's chalk drawing on a sidewalk, a couple holding hands outside a coffee shop. Framed each shot carefully, trying to capture the emotion Thomas had talked about, the authentic moments that made life meaningful. The photography felt like meditation, forcing him to slow down and really look at the world around him. Through the lens, saw things differently. The woman laughing on her phone wasn't just taking up sidewalk space, she was experiencing joy. The teenager skateboarding wasn't being reckless, he was finding freedom. Every person photographed had a story, a life as complex and real as his own, and somehow that realization was both humbling and liberating. Sunday morning, developed the photos in a darkroom he'd had installed in his basement years ago but never used. The equipment was dusty but still functional. As images emerged in the developing fluid, felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in business in years. These photographs weren't perfect, many were technically flawed, but they were his. They represented his vision, his choices, his attempt to capture something real. Arrived home Sunday evening as promised. Heard her car pull up and went to meet her in the foyer. She looked tired, her usual perfect composure slightly frayed around the edges. They stood facing each other, husband and wife who had become strangers, both knowing this conversation would change everything. "Should we sit down?" asked, and nodded, leading her to the informal living room, a space they rarely used because it felt too casual for the image they maintained. They sat on opposite ends of the sofa, a physical distance that matched the emotional distance between them. "I've been thinking all weekend," started, her voice more honest than I'd heard it in years. "About what you said about our marriage being empty, and you're right. We've been going through the motions for so long that I almost forgot what a real marriage should feel like." Waited, letting her continue. This was the most vulnerable he'd seen since the early days of their relationship, before their marriage became a business arrangement. "I don't love you," said, and the words should have hurt but instead brought relief. "I don't think I ever really did, not in the way a wife should love her husband. I loved what you represented, the security, the lifestyle, the partnership. But I never loved you as a person because I never really knew you as a person." "I know," said quietly. "I felt the same way. We made sense on paper and we both got what we thought we wanted. But somewhere along the way, we stopped even trying to be real with each other." nodded and saw tears in her eyes, the first genuine emotion he'd seen from her in months, maybe years. "I've been having an affair," she said, and felt surprise but not betrayal. "With Robert, my foundation's director. It started 6 months ago. I didn't tell you because I didn't think you'd care, and honestly, I wasn't sure I cared enough about our marriage to risk it ending." Absorbed this information, waiting for jealousy or anger, but feeling only a strange numbness. "I'm not angry," he said. "I think that says everything we need to know about where we are." "What about this woman you met?" asked. "Sarah, are you in love with her?" Considered the question carefully. "I don't know, I barely know her, but being around her made me realize what I've been missing. Not her specifically, but genuine connection, real emotion, living authentically instead of playing a role. She woke me up from a sleep I didn't even know I was in." They talked for hours, really talked, perhaps for the first time in their entire marriage. They discussed their regrets, their resentments, their mutual failures to build something real. The conversation was painful but necessary, peeling away layers of pretense to reveal the truth they'd both been avoiding. "I want a divorce," said finally and nodded. "I do too, but we need to do this carefully. The business, our public image, the foundations we support together. It needs to be handled strategically." Gave a small laugh, sad but genuine. "Even our divorce is a business decision. That's who we are, isn't it? Always calculating, always maintaining the image." "That's who we've been," corrected. "It doesn't have to be who we continue to be." They spent the next hour discussing logistics. Wanted to keep the Manhattan apartment and her position with the foundation. Would keep the estate and full control of Wellington Industries. Their assets would be divided equitably, their lawyers would handle the details, and they would present it to the public as an amicable separation. Two people who cared for each other, but realized they wanted different things from life. It was civilized and cold and exactly what their marriage had been. But underneath the business-like discussion, sensed relief from both of them. They were finally being honest, finally acknowledging what they'd both known for years. The marriage was over, had been over for a long time, and continuing it was just prolonging the inevitable. When went upstairs to start packing some of her things, returned to his study and called his lawyer. It was late Sunday night, but paid enough that his lawyer answered anyway. He explained the situation briefly and asked him to start the paperwork. "Keep it quiet as long as possible," instructed. "But make it happen quickly. We've both waited long enough to live honestly." Over the next few weeks, life became a whirlwind of lawyers, mediators, and carefully worded press releases. The divorce announcement was made public 3 weeks after his conversation with, framed as a mutual decision by two people who remained friends and business partners, but were no longer romantically involved. The public reaction was intense, but not as dramatic as had feared. Some gossiped, some speculated, but most accepted the explanation at face value. The business community was more concerned. Wellington Industries stock dipped initially on news of the divorce. Investors worried about instability in leadership. Spent several days reassuring board members and major shareholders that the company would be unaffected, that his focus remained sharp, that this was a personal matter with no impact on his professional responsibilities. But even as made these assurances, he knew they weren't entirely true. The divorce was making him question everything, not just his marriage, but his entire approach to life. He continued visiting Thomas's gallery, though he carefully avoided times when Sarah might be there. He'd respected her boundaries, understood that she needed distance from his complicated situation. Thomas never asked questions but made his support clear in small ways. A fresh cup of coffee waiting when arrived. A new photograph set aside that he thought would appreciate. Invitations to gallery events that usually declined but appreciated being included in. The older man had become something of a mentor, teaching not just about photography but about living authentically. One Thursday afternoon, about 2 months after his conversation with, was at the gallery studying a new collection when Thomas approached with his usual gentle smile. "She asks about you, you know." Didn't need clarification about who she was. His heart jumped at the mention of Sarah. "How is she?" "Good, busy with school as always, but she asks about you when she calls, whether you've been by, how you're doing, if you're still taking photographs." Thomas paused, then added, "She knows about the divorce. It was in the news." Nodded. The divorce had been covered extensively in the business press and society pages. Anyone paying attention would know. Does she have an opinion about it?" Thomas smiled knowingly. She's too wise to share opinions about other people's marriages, but I think she's glad you're making changes in your life. She wants people to be happy, to live authentically. That's just who she is. The conversation left restless. He wanted to see Sarah, wanted to tell her that he'd taken her advice, that he was figuring out his life, that he was choosing authenticity over image. But he also knew he needed to give her space, needed to respect the boundaries she'd set, needed to complete his own transformation before reaching out. So threw himself into his photography. He took his camera everywhere, documenting the city and its people with increasing skill. He studied the masters, read books on composition and lighting, practiced constantly. Photography became more than a hobby, it became a way of seeing the world, of connecting with the authentic moments that made life meaningful. He also made changes at work, promoted his talented but overlooked COO to a co-CEO position, sharing responsibilities he'd previously hoarded. He started leaving the office at reasonable hours, delegated more, trusted his team instead of micromanaging every decision. Surprisingly, the company didn't fall apart. In fact, with less controlling and more strategic, Wellington Industries began operating more efficiently. The divorce was finalized 4 months after the initial conversation with. They signed the papers in a lawyer's office, civilized and cordial to the end. Looked happier than had seen her in years, probably because she was free to be with Robert openly now. Wished her well and meant it. They'd both been trapped in a marriage neither wanted, and now they were both free. After the signing, drove to the gallery. He hadn't been there in 2 weeks, deliberately giving himself space to process the end of his marriage before returning. When he walked in, Thomas looked up from a catalog he was reviewing and broke into a genuine smile. "I was wondering when you'd come back. Coffee." They sat in the back office and told Thomas about the finalized divorce, about the changes he was making at work, about how different his life felt now that he was living more honestly. Thomas listened with the patient wisdom of someone who'd navigated his own share of life transitions. "You're finding your way," Thomas said. "It's not always a straight path and it's rarely comfortable, but you're doing it. I'm proud of you." The words touched more than he expected. His father had never been one for praise and had spent his adult life seeking validation through achievement. But Thomas's approval came from a different place, from recognition of personal growth rather than professional success, and somehow it mattered more. "I want to show you something," said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through the photographs he'd taken. Thomas studied them carefully, zooming in on details, asking questions about his choices. The older photographer's feedback was honest and constructive, pointing out what worked and what didn't, but overall, his assessment was positive. "You have a good eye," Thomas said. "These capture genuine moments. You're seeing the world with a photographer's eye now, not just a collector's eye. That's the difference between taking pictures and making art." They talked about photography techniques, about upcoming exhibitions, about the business of art versus the art of art. At some point, the conversation turned to Sarah, as it inevitably did. "She's thinking about applying for a principal position," Thomas said. "There's an opening at a school in a better neighborhood, better funding, better resources. She could make a real difference there." Felt a mix of pride and disappointment. Pride that Sarah was advancing in her career, disappointment that she might be moving further from his orbit. She'd be amazing at that. She has the passion and the skill. "She's conflicted, though," Thomas continued. "Her current school needs her. The kids there don't have many advocates, and Sarah's made real connections with them. The new position would be better for her career and probably her sanity, but her heart is with those kids." It was so perfectly Sarah thought, always choosing based on where she could make the most difference rather than what would benefit her most. "What do you think she'll decide?" Thomas shrugged. "With Sarah, it's hard to say. She follows her heart, but she also thinks carefully about where she can do the most good. She's been asking advice, but I think she already knows what she's going to do. She just needs to give herself permission to do it." Understood that feeling. He'd spent months knowing he needed to divorce, but needing to give himself permission to disrupt his carefully constructed life. Permission to choose authenticity over image, happiness over success, real connection over convenient arrangement. "Can I ask you something?" said, and Thomas nodded. "Why have you been so kind to me? You barely know me, and yet you've been like a mentor, a friend, supporting me through all this chaos." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because I see potential in you. When you first walked into my gallery, you were a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. Success without fulfillment, wealth without happiness, a perfect life that was perfectly empty. I've seen that before in people who built empires but lost themselves in the process. He paused, looking at with genuine affection. But I also saw someone willing to question that life, willing to be vulnerable enough to admit something was missing. That takes courage. Most people in your position would just buy a sports car or have an affair and call it a midlife crisis. You're actually doing the hard work of figuring out who you are and who you want to be. That's worth supporting. The words settled over like a benediction. He'd been so focused on external validation his whole life, building an empire to prove his worth, that he'd forgotten about internal validation, about living in a way that felt true to himself regardless of what others thought. They talked for another hour before finally left. As he drove home, he felt lighter than he had in months. The divorce was final, the business was stable, and he was starting to remember who he was beneath the billions and the image. He still didn't have all the answers, still didn't know what his life would look like going forward, but he was okay with that uncertainty. That night sat in his study with his camera, reviewing the day's photos. He'd spent the afternoon in the park, photographing people living their normal lives. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to ride a bike, a young couple having a picnic, a businessman feeding squirrels on his lunch break. Each image captured a moment of genuine life, people being themselves without pretense or performance. One photograph in particular caught attention. It showed a woman sitting on a bench, reading a book, completely absorbed in the story. The composition reminded him of Thomas's photograph of Sarah, the one that had started everything. But this woman was different, the moment was different, the meaning was different. Looking at the image, realized something important. He'd been so focused on Sarah as the catalyst for his change that he'd missed the deeper truth. Sarah hadn't caused his transformation. She'd revealed a transformation that was already trying to happen. Meeting her had cracked open a door that was already straining against its locks, giving voice to dissatisfaction he'd been feeling for years but refusing to acknowledge. The real question now wasn't about Sarah, or even about the divorce. It was about who Wellington wanted to be going forward. Did he want to continue being the ruthless CEO who built empires but had no real connections? Or did he want to be someone who valued relationships and authenticity, who created meaningful work rather than just profitable work, who lived with purpose rather than just success? Set his camera aside and pulled out his laptop. He opened a document and started writing, not a business plan or strategic memo, but something more personal. A mission statement for his life, separate from his company. What did he value? What did he want to accomplish that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings? What legacy did he want to leave beyond Wellington Industries? The words came slowly at first, then faster as connected with thoughts and feelings he'd suppressed for years. He wrote about wanting to make a difference beyond just creating shareholder value, about using his resources to support real change in communities that needed it, about living authentically and encouraging others to do the same, about the importance of art and beauty and human connection in a world that often valued only profit and efficiency. By the time finished, it was after midnight. He read through what he'd written, surprised by his own clarity. This was his path forward, a way to integrate the businessman he was with the person he wanted to become. He didn't have to abandon Wellington Industries or his responsibilities. He just had to expand his definition of success to include things that couldn't be measured in dollars. The next morning called an all-hands meeting at Wellington Industries. His executive team looked nervous, worried about what announcement he might make. The divorce had already sent shockwaves through the company, and there were rumors might step down, might sell the company, might do something drastic. Instead, announced a new initiative. Wellington Industries would be establishing a foundation, separate from the company but funded by his personal wealth, focused on supporting education in communities. They would fund teacher salaries, provide resources for schools, create scholarship programs, do whatever was needed to give kids the kind of quality education that should be every child's right. Education is the foundation of opportunity, told his assembled team. We've built this company on innovation and talent, and both of those things start with education. It's time we gave back in a way that actually matters, in a way that creates lasting change. The announcement was met with surprise, but also enthusiasm. Several executives immediately volunteered to help with the foundation, energized by a mission that felt more meaningful than quarterly earnings reports. Assistant Jennifer, who'd been with him for 10 years, had tears in her eyes. "This is beautiful, Mr. Wellington. This is going to change lives." Over the following weeks, threw himself into planning the foundation. He hired experts in education policy, consulted with teachers and administrators, visited schools in areas to see firsthand what was needed. The work was consuming, but in a completely different way than business had been. This felt purposeful, felt like it mattered in ways that went beyond his bank account. One afternoon, while touring a struggling elementary school in one of the city's neighborhoods, recognized the name. This was Sarah's school, the one Thomas had mentioned she worked at. His heart raced as he walked through the hallways, wondering if he might see her, uncertain whether he wanted to or not. He didn't see her during the tour and told himself he was relieved. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet, wasn't sure what he would say. But as he was leaving, he passed a classroom with a door slightly ajar. Curiosity drew him to look inside. There was Sarah, standing in front of a class of about 20 students, all of them focused on her with the kind of attention that only a truly great teacher can command. She was explaining something about fractions, using a pizza diagram, making math come alive in a way that made even interested. Stood in the hallway, watching through the gap in the door, mesmerized. This was Sarah in her element, doing what she loved, making a difference one child at a time. He could see why she'd chosen teaching over law, could see the impact she had on these kids who clearly adored her. One of the students spotted in the hallway and pointed. Sarah turned, and their eyes met for the first time in months. The recognition in her face was instant, followed by surprise, then something that might have been happiness. Felt his pulse quicken, felt the same pull he'd experienced that first day in the gallery. Sarah said something to her class and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her. They stood facing each other, both uncertain, both carrying months of unspoken words. Sarah said, and just hearing her say his name made his chest tighten. "What are you doing here?" "I'm starting an education foundation. I was touring schools to see what kind of resources are needed." He paused, then added honestly, "I didn't know you taught here specifically, but I was hoping I might see you." Sarah looked at him, really looked, and wondered what she saw. Did she see the changes he'd made? Could she tell that he was different now, more honest, more himself? "I heard about the divorce," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sorry if it was difficult." "It wasn't," said. "Not really. It was necessary and overdue and ultimately a relief for both of us. I'm figuring out my life like you suggested. I'm trying to be more authentic, to live with purpose instead of just success." Sarah smiled and felt warmth spread through his chest. "I can see that. An education foundation helping schools like this one, that's amazing. These kids need people like you paying attention to them." Before could respond, the principal who'd been giving him the tour appeared, looking for him. Had to go, had to finish the tour and the meeting, but he didn't want to. He wanted to stay in this hallway, talking to Sarah, reconnecting with the woman who'd woken him up. "Can we talk?" asked quickly before the principal reached them. "Really talk, maybe coffee sometime." Sarah hesitated and could see the conflict in her face, but finally she nodded. Coffee would be nice, but just coffee as friends. "As friends," agreed, even though the word felt inadequate for what he felt. "I'll call Thomas and get your number if that's okay." Sarah smiled. "That's okay, it's good to see you, you look happier." "I am happier," said honestly, "or at least I'm working on it." The principal arrived and had to leave. He finished the tour, sat through the meeting about the foundation's potential impact, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd seen Sarah again, talked to her, made a plan to meet for coffee. It wasn't much, but it felt like everything. It felt like the universe giving him another chance, an opportunity to reconnect with the person who'd catalyzed so much change in his life. That evening called Thomas and asked for Sarah's number. The older man gave it without hesitation, but with a piece of advice. "Take it slow. She cares about you, I can see that. But she's cautious, and she should be. You're still figuring yourself out, and she deserves someone who's already figured it out." "I know," said. "I'm not trying to rush anything. I just want to be in her life in whatever way she's comfortable with. She's important to me, Thomas, more important than I realized." "I know that too," Thomas said kindly. "Just remember, she's not a prize to be won or a problem to be solved. She's a person with her own life and her own choices. Respect that, and whatever is meant to happen will happen." The wisdom in Thomas's words settled over like a weight and a relief. He'd spent his whole life approaching things like business deals, strategies to be executed, goals to be achieved. But relationships didn't work that way. People weren't acquisitions to be negotiated or markets to be captured. They were complex and messy and required vulnerability and patience. Waited 2 days before texting Sarah, not wanting to seem too eager but also not wanting to let too much time pass. He suggested coffee that weekend, left the choice of place to her, kept it casual and friendly. Her response came an hour later, warm and agreeable. They made plans for Saturday morning at a small near her apartment. The next few days passed slowly. Continued working on the foundation, met with his executive team, fulfilled his responsibilities at Wellington Industries. But part of his mind was already at that, imagining the conversation, hoping he wouldn't mess it up, wondering what this could become if he did it right. Saturday morning arrived and drove to the 30 minutes early. He parked around the corner and walked the streets, trying to burn off nervous energy. This mattered to him in a way business deals never had, and the stakes felt impossibly high. He wasn't just trying to reconnect with someone he cared about, he was trying to prove that he'd changed, that he was capable of authentic connection, that he could be the kind of person Sarah deserved. When finally entered at exactly the agreed-upon time, Sarah was already there. She was sitting by the window with a cup of tea, reading a book, completely absorbed. Stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her, feeling grateful for this chance to try again, to build something real this time instead of just going through the motions. Sarah looked up, saw him, and smiled. It was a genuine smile, warm and welcoming, and felt hope bloom in his chest. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe if he took it slow, respected her boundaries, let things develop naturally, something real could grow between them. Not based on his wealth or status, but on genuine connection, shared values, and the kind of authenticity he was finally learning to embrace. It was warm and cozy, filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and the gentle murmur of weekend conversations. Sat across from Sarah, both of them holding warm cups, both of them slightly uncertain about how to begin. The months apart had created a distance that wasn't quite awkward but wasn't entirely comfortable either. Sarah broke the silence first. "So an education foundation, tell me about it." Relaxed slightly, grateful for the neutral starting point. He explained his vision, how he wanted to support schools in communities, fund teacher salaries, provide resources, create opportunities for kids who deserved better than what they were getting. As he talked, Sarah's eyes lit up with genuine interest and excitement. "This is incredible. Do you know how many schools are desperate for this kind of support? How many kids could benefit?" She leaned forward, her enthusiasm evident. "What made you choose education?" Considered his answer carefully. He could give the safe response, talk about education being the foundation of opportunity or some other corporate platitude. But he'd promised himself authenticity, and Sarah deserved the truth. "You did," he said simply. "Watching your passion for teaching, hearing you talk about your students, seeing the difference you make in their lives. It made me realize that real impact isn't about quarterly earnings or stock prices. It's about changing lives one person at a time. You showed me that." Sarah's expression softened, touched, but also cautious. "That's a lot of credit to give me for your decision." "Maybe," agreed, "but it's true. Meeting you was a catalyst for a lot of changes in my life, not just the divorce, though that too. But you made me question everything about how I'd been living, what I valued, what legacy I wanted to leave. You woke me up, Sarah." They talked for hours, the conversation flowing easier as they relaxed into each other's company. Shared stories about his photography, showing Sarah some of his recent work on his phone. She was impressed, offering genuine praise and thoughtful critique. They discussed his foundation plans in detail, Sarah contributing ideas from her experience teaching in schools. "The challenge isn't just money," Sarah explained. "Though money helps tremendously, it's also about systemic support. Teachers need training, students need counseling services, parents need to be engaged. It's complex and interconnected." Pulled out a notebook and started taking notes, genuinely interested in her insights. This wasn't a business meeting, but her expertise was valuable, and he wanted to do this right. Sarah watched him write, a small smile on her face. "What?" asked, noticing her expression. "Nothing, it's just nice to see you so engaged with something that actually matters. When I first met you, you seemed kind of lost, like you were going through the motions. Now you seem alive." "I am alive," said. "For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, I feel like I'm living instead of just existing. That's because of you." Sarah shook her head gently. "No, it's because of you. I might have been a catalyst, but you did the hard work. You examined your life, made difficult changes, chose authenticity over comfort. That was all you." The conversation continued. touching on everything from his divorce to her potential principal position to their shared love of photography. Learned that Sarah had decided to stay at her current school, turning down the principal position because her students needed her more. It was tempting, she admitted. Better pay, better resources, less stress. But every time I thought about leaving, I pictured my students' faces. These kids have had so many people give up on them already. I couldn't be another person who left when things got tough. Felt admiration well up inside him. Sarah made choices based on what mattered rather than what benefited her, and he wanted to be more like that. His foundation was a start, but he needed to carry that philosophy into all aspects of his life. As they talked, realized something had shifted between them. The tension from before, the complicated feelings and impossible circumstances had eased. They were talking as friends, genuinely enjoying each other's company without the weight of unfulfilled longing. It felt healthier, more sustainable. When they finally left it was early afternoon. They'd been talking for nearly 4 hours and couldn't remember the last time he'd enjoyed a conversation so much. They stood on the sidewalk outside, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Can we do this again?" asked. "I've missed talking to you." Sarah smiled. "I'd like that, I've missed it too." Over the following months, coffee became a regular thing. Every couple of weeks, and Sarah would meet at the same, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Learned more about her students, her challenges as a teacher, her small victories and frustrating setbacks. Sarah learned about his foundation's progress, his continued photography pursuits, his evolving relationship with work. Their friendship deepened, built on genuine connection rather than romantic attraction, though couldn't deny that attraction was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But he respected Sarah's boundaries, valued their friendship too much to risk it by pushing for more. If this was all they could be, friends who met for coffee and shared their lives, that was enough. It was more than he'd had before. His foundation officially launched 6 months after his initial tour of Sarah's school. The opening ceremony was a major event, covered by news outlets and attended by politicians, educators, and community leaders. Gave a speech about the importance of education and equal opportunity, talking about his own privileged background and his responsibility to help level the playing field for kids who weren't born with his advantages. Sarah attended the ceremony, sitting in the back with Thomas, spotted them during his speech and felt his heart swell. These two people, a teacher and a photographer, had changed his life more than any business deal or acquisition ever could. After the ceremony, during the reception, made his way through the crowd to where they stood. "Thank you for coming," he said, genuinely grateful. "It means a lot to have you both here." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "We wouldn't have missed it. This is good work you're doing, important work." Sarah nodded in agreement. "I've already talked to 3 teachers from other schools about applying for funding. This is going to make such a difference." As they talked, a photographer from one of the news outlets approached, asking if he could take photo. Agreed, but asked if Sarah and Thomas could be in it too. "These two are the real inspiration behind the foundation," he explained to the photographer. The 3 of them posed together, in the middle with Sarah and Thomas flanking him. The photographer snapped several shots and moved on. Thought nothing more of it until the next day when he saw the photo on the front page of the business section, accompanied by an article about the foundation. The caption read, "Wellington, billionaire philanthropist, with Sarah, educator, and Thomas, photographer, at the launch of the Wellington Education Foundation." Studied the photo. He looked happy in it, genuinely happy in a way he'd never looked in corporate photos. Sarah was smiling, her arm around her father's shoulder. Thomas looked proud. They looked like friends, like people who genuinely cared about each other, not just business associates or social acquaintances. He framed the photo and hung it in his study, alongside the photographs he'd bought from Thomas all those months ago. It represented something important, a moment when different parts of his life came together, when success and meaning aligned instead of conflicting. The foundation's impact was immediate and significant. Within the first year, they'd funded salary increases for 300 teachers in schools, provided technology and books to 50 schools, and created scholarship programs for students who showed promise but lacked resources. Visited schools regularly, talking to teachers and students, seeing firsthand the difference the funding was making. During one visit to Sarah's school, now fully funded by the foundation, sat in on her class. She was teaching her students about fractions using pizza again, and the kids were engaged and eager. After class, several students crowded around, asking questions about his work, his cars, his house. He answered honestly, then turned the questions back on them. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" he asked a girl named Maria. "A doctor," she said confidently. "I want to help people who are sick." Smiled, "That's wonderful. You can do that. Ms. is teaching you everything you need to know to achieve that dream." The girl beamed and Sarah caught's eye, her expression grateful. After the students left for lunch, she approached him. "Thank you for that. These kids need to believe that their dreams are possible." "They are possible," said. "With teachers like you and the right support, anything is possible for them." As drove back to his office that afternoon, he thought about Maria and her dream of becoming a doctor. Would she make it? Would the support from his foundation be enough to help her overcome the obstacles poverty placed in her path? He didn't know, but he was determined to give her, and thousands of other kids, the best chance possible. That evening was in his study going through photos he'd taken that day at the school when his phone rang. It was Thomas, and his voice was strained in a way had never heard before. "I need to ask you for help. It's Sarah." His heart stopped. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She's fine, she's not hurt. But there's a situation at her school. One of her students, a boy named David, his home situation is bad, really bad. His mother's boyfriend has been abusing them both, and it came to a head today. The authorities are involved, but David needs a place to stay while they sort things out, and Sarah's trying to take him in, but her apartment is tiny, and she doesn't have the resources to properly care for a traumatized kid who needs professional support." Was already grabbing his keys. "Where are you?" Thomas gave him the address of the school and drove there faster than he probably should have. When he arrived, he found Sarah sitting in her classroom with a small boy who looked to be about 8 years old. The child was huddled in a chair, eyes red from crying, clutching a backpack that probably contained everything he owned. Sarah looked up when entered, relief and uncertainty warring on her face. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did. Tell me what you need." Over the next few hours, learned about David's situation. His mother was in the hospital, injured by her boyfriend who was now in custody. David had no other family willing to take him in, and the foster system was overwhelmed. Sarah had immediately offered to care for him, but her small apartment and teacher's salary weren't equipped to handle a child with significant trauma who would need counseling, medical attention, and ongoing support. "I can help," said. "I have space, resources, whatever's needed. If you're willing to be his guardian, I can provide the financial support and help arrange for therapists, doctors, whatever he needs." Sarah looked at with something like wonder. "You do that? You don't even know him." "I know you," said simply. "And I know you wouldn't fight this hard for someone who didn't deserve it. Plus, this is exactly what the foundation is for. Supporting kids who need it, giving them a chance." What followed was a whirlwind of legal consultations, meetings with social workers, and arrangements for David's care. Sarah officially became his foster mother with the goal of eventual adoption, covered all expenses, and arranged for David to see a trauma therapist 3 times a week. He also quietly arranged for Sarah to receive a housing upgrade, moving her into a larger apartment in a safer neighborhood, all covered by the foundation as part of a new program supporting foster families. Sarah protested the help initially, uncomfortable with accepting so much, but was insistent. "You're taking care of a child who desperately needs you. The least I can do is make sure you have the resources to do it well. This isn't charity, Sarah. This is an investment in a child's future." Over the following months, watched Sarah transform David's life. The angry, scared boy gradually became more trusting, more open. He started doing better in school, made friends, even smiled occasionally. Sarah's patience and love were exactly what he needed, and felt privileged to support their journey. He found himself spending more time with them, helping with homework, teaching David photography, taking them both to museums and parks. It wasn't intentional at first, but gradually became part of their small family unit. Not as a father figure exactly, but as a supportive presence, someone who cared and showed up. One Saturday afternoon, about a year after David had come to live with Sarah, the 3 of them were in the park. David was practicing with a camera had bought him, taking photos of birds and trees with the serious concentration of a child discovering a new passion. Sarah sat on a bench watching him, companionable silence between them. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for everything you've done for us, for David especially." Shook his head. "I should be thanking you. Watching you with David, seeing the difference you're making in his life, it reminds me what actually matters. Money and success are fine, but this, what you're doing, this is real impact. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Always." "Are you happy, really happy? I know you've made all these changes, the divorce, the foundation, reconnecting with photography. But are you actually happy?" Considered the question seriously. Was he happy? He was certainly different than he'd been a year and a half ago when he'd first walked into Thomas's gallery. He was more authentic, more connected to his own values, more purposeful in his choices. But happy. "I'm getting there," he said honestly. "I'm happier than I was. I feel like I'm building a life that means something instead of just accumulating success. But there are still pieces missing." "Like what?" Looked at Sarah, really looked at her, seeing the woman who'd catalyzed so much change in his life, who'd shown him what authentic living looked like, who'd become one of his closest friends. The attraction was still there, stronger if anything, but tempered by genuine respect and deep affection. "Like someone to share it all with," he said carefully. "The foundation's success means more when I can talk about it with someone who gets why it matters. The photographs I take feel more meaningful when there's someone to show them to who actually cares. The hard days are easier when there's someone to lean on. I have friends, I have Thomas, I have you. But there's a difference between friendship and partnership." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "Have you thought about dating? You've been divorced for over a year now. You could start putting yourself out there." Smiled slightly. "I've thought about it, but the truth is I compare everyone to a certain teacher I know, and they all fall short." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable, not quite a declaration, but close. Sarah's breath caught, her eyes searching his face. "I know," he said quickly. "I know the timing might not be right, or maybe I'm not what you're looking for, or maybe friendship is all this can be, but I needed to say it. You asked if I was happy, and the truth is, the piece that's missing is you. Not just as a friend, though I value our friendship more than I can express, but as a partner, as someone to build a life with, as someone to share everything with." Sarah was quiet, her expression thoughtful and conflicted. Waited, his heart pounding, knowing he'd just put everything on the line but unable to regret it. He'd spent too much of his life not being honest about what he wanted. Whatever Sarah's answer, at least he'd been authentic. "I care about you," Sarah said finally. "I think you know that. These past months, becoming friends again, watching you with David, seeing the man you become, it's been special. But I'm scared. You're still figuring yourself out, still learning how to live authentically. What if this is just part of that journey? What if 6 months from now you realize you were attracted to the idea of me, the life I represent, but not actually me?" "That's not what this is," said firmly. "I understand why you'd worry about that, but I've had a year and a half to figure out what I want. I've dated other people, tried to move on, but no one compares to you. It's not about what you represent or the life you live. It's about who you are. Your compassion, your integrity, your passion for making a difference, your laugh, the way you see the good in people, including me. I'm not in love with an idea, Sarah. I'm in love with you." The words were out, honest and true, and felt both liberated and terrified. Sarah's eyes widened, tears forming at the corners. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, David ran over, excited to show them a photo he'd taken of a butterfly. The moment was broken, but something had shifted. Sarah looked at the photo, praised David's composition, suggested an adjustment for next time. But her hand found on the bench between them, fingers intertwining, squeezing gently. It wasn't an answer, not yet, but it was something. It was possibility. They stayed in the park for another hour, playing with David, taking photos together, being a unit. When they finally left, Sarah invited back to the apartment for dinner. It was a casual invitation, something that had happened dozens of times before, but tonight it felt different. Charged with potential, weighted with the conversation they'd started but not finished. David fell asleep on the couch after dinner, exhausted from the park. Sarah covered him with a blanket and joined in the kitchen where he was washing dishes. They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm domestic and familiar. When the last dish was put away, Sarah turned to, "Can we talk about what you said earlier?" They moved to the small balcony off her living room, sitting in the 2 chairs Sarah kept out there. The city lights sparkled below them, and the evening air was warm and gentle. "I've been thinking about us for a while," Sarah admitted, "wondering if there could be more than friendship, but I was afraid to hope for it. Your life is so different from mine. You're a billionaire, I'm a teacher. You move in circles I can't even imagine. How would that work?" took her hand, the gesture feeling natural and right. My life is only different if I keep it different. Yes, I have money, but money doesn't dictate how I live or who I spend time with. I choose that. And I choose you, Sarah. I choose late dinners after you've finished grading papers. I choose weekends in the park with David. I choose conversations about education policy and photography. I choose real connection over social climbing. I choose you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is simple. Maybe we've been overthinking it. I love you. I want to build a life with you and David. Whatever that looks like, whatever shape it takes, I'm all in, if you'll have me. Sarah leaned forward and met her halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that felt like coming home. It was gentle and sweet and perfect, containing all the hope and possibility of a new beginning. When they pulled apart, Sarah was crying for real now, happy tears streaming down her face. I love you too. I think I have for a long time. I was just too scared to admit it. Pulled her clothes, and they sat together in the warm evening air, holding each other, feeling the weight of the past year and a half lifting. They'd both been on journeys, Sarah supporting a traumatized child, discovering who he was beyond his wealth. Now their paths were merging, creating something new. So what happens now? Sarah asked, her head on shoulder. Now we figure it out together, said. One day at a time. No pressure, no expectations beyond being honest with each other and showing up. We build something real, something that's ours. Over the following months, that's exactly what they did. And Sarah built a relationship grounded in authenticity and mutual respect. They navigated the challenges of public profile and Sarah's desire for privacy. They introduced David to the idea of being more than just a friend, taking it slow, making sure the boy felt safe and included in any decisions. His friends and business associates were surprised by his choice of partner. Some couldn't understand what a billionaire saw in an elementary school teacher, but didn't care about their opinions. He'd spent too much of his life caring what other people thought. What mattered was that Sarah saw him, the real him, and loved him anyway. What mattered was building a life that felt authentic and meaningful. The foundation continued to grow, now with Sarah as an active advisor. She brought insights from the ground level, understanding what schools and students actually needed versus what looked good in press releases. Together, they created programs that made real differences in real lives. Photography evolved too. He started teaching workshops for kids in the schools the foundation supported, sharing his love of capturing genuine moments. Some of his best photographs were of Sarah with her students, or David exploring the world through his camera, or Thomas in his gallery surrounded by art. 1 year after their first kiss on Sarah's balcony, proposed. Not with a massive ring and an elaborate setup, but simply, authentically. They were at Thomas's gallery looking at a new exhibition when got down on one knee. Sarah, you woke me up when I was sleepwalking through life. You showed me what authenticity looks like, what real connection feels like, what matters beyond success and wealth. You've made me a better person, a better man. Will you marry me? Sarah said yes through happy tears. And Thomas, who'd been watching from across the gallery with a knowing smile, produced a bottle of champagne he'd apparently been keeping ready for exactly this moment. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the gallery that had brought them together, with only close friends and family attending. David served as ring bearer, serious and proud in his role. Thomas walked Sarah down the aisle, his face radiant with joy. His executive team attended, as did teachers from Sarah's school and kids from the foundation's programs. It was an eclectic mix that perfectly represented the life they'd built together. In his vows, spoke about the photograph that had first captured his attention, the one of Sarah sitting on a bench at a crossroads. You were choosing your path that day, he said. And somehow, incredibly, that path led to me. You've taught me that success without meaning is emptiness, that wealth without purpose is poverty, that image without authenticity is imprisonment. You've taught me to live, really live, and I promise to spend the rest of my life honoring that gift. Sarah's vows talked about second chances and unexpected journeys. You walked into my father's gallery looking for art but really looking for yourself, she said. And in finding yourself, you found me. You've shown me that people can change, that privilege can be used for good, that billionaires can be human too. The guests laughed at that, and Sarah smiled. I promise to keep you grounded, to challenge you when you need challenging, to support you in all your endeavors, and to love you exactly as you are, billions and all. After the ceremony, as they celebrated with their mismatched but perfect group of loved ones, caught sight of the photograph that had started everything. Thomas had hung it in a place of honor at the gallery and stood before it, Sarah's hand in his, marveling at the journey that had brought him here. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. Pulled her close, kissing her temple. "I'm thinking about crossroads. You stood at yours and chose teaching over law, meaning over prestige. I stood at mine and chose authenticity over image, connection over emptiness. And somehow those choices led us both to this moment." Sarah smiled up at him. "No regrets." "Not a single one," said honestly. "I traded an empty mansion for a full life. I traded a loveless marriage for genuine partnership. I traded sleepwalking for living. Best trade I ever made." They danced together in the gallery, surrounded by photographs of genuine human emotion, surrounded by people who loved them, surrounded by the authenticity they'd both fought to achieve. Looked around at his new family, at Thomas beaming with pride, at David laughing with other children, at colleagues from two completely different worlds mingling and connecting, and felt overwhelming gratitude. He'd come into this gallery 18 months ago as Wellington Billionaire CEO, a man who had everything and nothing. He was leaving it as Wellington, husband, friend, philanthropist, photographer, a man who discovered that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or sold. They had to be built, one authentic moment at a time, one genuine connection at a time, one brave choice at a time. Years later, when asked about the secret to his happiness, would point to the photograph still hanging on his study wall, the one of a woman at a crossroads choosing her path. "That's where it started," he'd say. "The day I saw that photograph and realized I was at my own crossroads, the day I chose to wake up and start living." But he'd also point to the photograph taken at his foundation's launch, the one showing him with Sarah and Thomas, all three smiling genuinely. "And that's where it became real," he'd explain. "When different parts of my life came together, when success and meaning aligned, when I stopped performing and started living." The foundation thrived, changing thousands of lives. His photography became respected in artistic circles. David grew up secure and loved, eventually becoming a photographer himself. Thomas continued running his gallery, proud of his daughter and the man she'd married, proud of the life they'd built together. And Sarah built a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. Not because of wealth, though they had that. Not because of status, though maintained his business success. But because they'd both chosen authenticity, chosen connection, chosen to value what was real over what looked good. They'd chosen each other, and that choice made all the difference. The billionaire who'd once had everything but felt empty had found fullness in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person. And every day he was grateful for the chance encounter in a small gallery, for a photograph that had caught his eye, for a woman who'd taught him that the best things in life were the ones you couldn't buy. They were the ones you had to earn through vulnerability, authenticity, and the courage to choose meaning over success, connection over image, love over convenience. Wellington had finally found what he'd been looking for, and it had been waiting for him all along in a photograph on a gallery wall, in the eyes of a teacher who chose impact over income, in the wisdom of a photographer who chose art over commerce. He'd found himself, and in doing so, he'd found everything that truly mattered. Crossed the and sat down across from Sarah, ready to begin again, this time as the person he was becoming rather than the person he used to be. Whatever happened next, he knew it would be real. And real was all that mattered, of choosing authenticity over image. It would be messy and complicated and painful, but it would be real. And real was finally beginning to understand was what mattered most built around himself. A first step towards something he couldn't yet name but desperately needed to find. Tomorrow, he would return to being the billionaire CEO, making decisions that affected thousands, maintaining the empire he'd built. But tonight, he was just a man who'd remembered what it felt like to be human, and that was enough.